Welcome, everyone. We are going to get started in just a minute. Just waiting for some people to join us. Happy Friday. We'll get started in just a minute or two, so bear with us. Thank you for your patience. And thanks for joining us for this series today. Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hopefully people will continue to join us. But in the interest of your time, thank you all for joining us. My name is Katie Ensign, and I am the Vice President for Placemaking and Administration at the Jessie Ball duPont Fund. And we are partnering with the Jaxson, the Jessie Ball duPont Fund is, to put on this series, the Jacksonville History and Heritage Series, which is really a way for us to highlight Jacksonville's really interesting and rich history. Many of us don't know a lot about it. We don't talk about it a lot. And so we've spent the last year putting on a variety of different webinars to help us understand our own history and heritage, which we think is really important as we continue to define ourselves. What does it mean to be a Jaxson? And what does our history and heritage really look like? And so I don't know if you're familiar with the Jaxson, but it is a really important interactive media platform led by Ennis, who's with us today. And it really is all about Jacksonville, its past, present, and future. And so obviously the Jaxson is a great partner of ours, and Ennis certainly is as well. So it's really a multimedia project. And Ennis Davis himself, I'm sure all of you know. If you don't, you should. Ennis is a certified senior planner and has written many award-winning books, including Reclaiming Jacksonville, The Coen Brothers, The Big Store, and Images of Modern America, Jacksonville. He is a mayoral appointee to the Northeast Florida Regional Transportation Commission. And he's just all things Jacksonville history. So he's the expert here. And so thanks, Ennis, and thank you all for joining us for this particular webinar series on Withintrification and the color of law. And with that, I will pass it over to Ennis.
All right, thank you, Katie. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We'll get started. So good afternoon. My name is Ennis Davis, and I'm VP or Vice President of Membership and Outreach for the American Planning Association's Florida chapter, as well as a trustee for the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation. And I'll be a moderator for today's panel discussion. So what happens when we realize that the impacts of gentrification aren't all positive, especially for many of the original residents in the neighborhood? How can communities develop and grow with the leadership of their existing residents at the forefront? As we continue to celebrate the role that planning plays in creating great communities as a part of October being National Community Planning Month, we're elated to have you join us today as we highlight the emerging strategy of Withintrification and how it can be applied to our historic neighborhoods. As we continue with this discussion, there are three primary objectives we'll be focusing on today. The first is understanding the difference between gentrification and Withintrification and the characteristics of each revitalization strategy. The second is understanding the public policies that have played or have influenced how our neighborhoods have been developed the way they are today. And then the third is empowering advocates of Withintrification and letting people better understand how they can get involved in these efforts. So feel free to share your thoughts on this topic in the chat as we continue to go forward. The Jacksonville as we know it today has always been shaped by more than a century of public policies that have been made at the local, state, and federal level. For example, Plessy v. Ferguson was a landmark decision of the US Supreme Court that upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation laws for public facilities as long as the segregated facilities were equal in quality. This 1896 decision became known as separate but equal, upholding the enforcement of Jim Crow laws across the South. In Jacksonville, combined with the Great Fire in 1901, the establishment of segregation fueled the growth and development of Jacksonville's urban core, which largely remains segregated today. The physical and economic differences between the built environments of neighborhoods like Northwest Jacksonville and historic Eastside, in comparison to Riverside, Murray Hill, and San Marco, are largely the result of a series of public policies that in many cases were intentionally discriminatory. During the mid-1920s, Jacksonville became the first city in Florida to adopt a comprehensive plan and zoning ordinance. Created by George W. Simons Jr., this plan used Euclidean or exclusionary zoning practices to force undesirable heavy industry in the city's Black neighborhoods to foster a better quality of life within neighborhoods where African Americans were not legally allowed to reside. A few years later, the National Housing Act of 1934 led to the creation of residential security maps that ranked neighborhoods by the estimated riskiness of mortgage loans. Known as redlining, this discriminatory practice resulted in the same disenfranchised Black communities across the city being fenced off as areas where banks would avoid investments based off community demographics. This combination of these zoning and public policy decisions led to those redline neighborhoods being characterized by heavy industry being located immediately adjacent to residential uses, while restricting the upward economic mobility of the population to relocate from these designated areas, while also securing the necessary financing to properly invest within them. Despite being forced to reside in a separate but unequal landscape, residents in these communities built off the economic foundation of segregation still found a way to build a self-sustaining environment filled with history, culture, food, music, community, and an authentic sense of place. Nevertheless, several additional public policies and planning decisions would eventually rip apart the built environment and economic conditions of these communities. For example, the Housing Act in 1937 allowed for the urban renewal to come in the form of leveling most of Ansontown, a community that was located off State Street, in order to create housing projects. The establishment of the Jacksonville Expressway Authority in 1955 also became a tool that was used to slice through redline communities, forming new barriers with paths largely based upon the desire to physically separate the city by race. With the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, an unintended consequence was the destruction of Black neighborhood business districts as a result of decades of unequal public investment, leaving them unable to compete with other areas of the region. Even the integration of the Duval County Public School System in 1971 resulted in local planning decisions that closed the majority of public schools in Black and redline communities, further weakening their economic foundation. Many of these policies were layered upon neighborhoods that were intentionally redlined decades earlier. For example, the lion's share of the Jacksonville's expressway system that was built in the 1950s and 1960s was built through redline communities that were labeled hazardous and definitely declining during the 1930s. Nearly 3,000 properties alone were taken for the construction of I-95, which leveled large portions of Brooklyn, Campbell Hill, La Villa, Sugar Hill, and Moncrief. As a new barrier, historic neighborhoods on the downtown side of I-95 later bear the brunt of urban renewal strategies ranging from the Hogan's Creek urban renewal project in the 1970s to the decimation of La Villa during the 1990s. Nevertheless, against all odds, many of Northeast Florida's historic, traditionally redline communities still survive. From Lincolnville and St. Augustine to Durkee Gardens in Northwest Jacksonville, the longtime residents, architecture, density, and culture are a strong part of the region's authentic Southern identity. However, planning and public policy and how the community is or is not engaged in the decision-making process for its future continues to serve as tools that can either strengthen or destroy the culture, architecture, and historic sense of place of what is left. Brooklyn would be a local example when planning fails. Platted in 1868, the neighborhood was ripped apart by the construction of Interstate 95 in 1960, and the 1980s Downtown Development Authority action plan that demolished 183 structures and displaced 550 residents before failing to build what had been planned. Additional demolition of its commercial district came during the 2000s, widening Riverside Avenue and Forest Street. Today, Brooklyn is in the midst of a major urban redevelopment boom. However, that sense of place, history, and story, the people who called the neighborhood home for 150 years is forever lost, erased by new population and modern built environment without authentic character. This is known as gentrification. Gentrification is the process whereby the character of an established urban area is changed by a wealthier population moving in, improving housing, and attracting new businesses while displacing long-time residents in the process. This is not to say that revitalization is not desired within historically excluded and redline communities. However, as illustrated on the screen, the continued resurgence of St. Petersburg's Deuces neighborhood is an example of the process of withintrification. In contrast to gentrification, withintrification refers to revitalization that is driven by people already in the community. It means identifying assets in the community, bringing them together under common objectives, and raising the value of the place from within at a pace appropriate for revitalizing the existing community, not displacing it and not destroying the cultural heritage sites that are important to the community in the process. Public policies we create, the developments we approve, the history we either respect or ignore are all significant factors in building up or destroying traditionally redline populations and neighborhoods. As we continue our quest to discover and build upon what makes Jacksonville a special place, highlighting our history as well as these special neighborhoods are very important parts of what we're going to be looking at in terms of our learning objectives. So we hope today that this discussion helps each of us again understand the difference between gentrification and withintrification, as well as the characteristics of these revitalization strategies, understanding how public policies have influenced our neighborhoods and how they've had a factor into the built environment that is there today, and as well as finding ways to empower advocates for withintrification and getting more people involved. So again, feel free to share your thoughts in the chat box during this discussion. So as today's moderator, I'm honored to be joined by three great panelists. Our first panelist is Caroline Howard. She is a Master of Public Health student at the University of North Florida, where she has been studying how long-standing geographic inequalities affect a community's health and wealth. Born and raised in Jacksonville, she was awarded the 2020 Undergraduate Researcher of the Year Award for her research in examining contemporary impact of redline in Jacksonville. We also have with us today Anthony Brown. He is the co-chair of the Economic Committee of the Executive Committee of the NAACP, Jacksonville branch, as well as the founder of Soul Fresh, Students to Troops, Operation Tiger Paw, Red Alliance for Justice and Restoration of Pride, and who is dedicated to revitalization of Black communities. And we also have with us today Suzanne Pickett, who is the Executive Director of Historic Jacksonville Community, or Historic Eastside Community Development Corporation, and a contemporary artist inspired by the notions of the human spirit and its interaction with nature. So feel free to use the chat room to post any questions that you may have for our panelists to answer. But to get started, I want to turn to Caroline, and I have a question for you. My question is, in 2020, you were honored as the Undergraduate Research of the Year at UNF for your research in examining the contemporary impact of redlining in Jacksonville. Can you tell us a bit about this research effort and share some key observations and lessons that you have learned that stood out to you?
Hi, thank you, Ennis, for that introduction to the topic and to myself. Let me share my screen with you all. Okay, great. So I'm excited to talk about that today. And before we get into the topic specifically of redlining, let me tell you a little bit about my own history with the topic. So as I was introduced, I'm born and raised in Jacksonville, Florida, and really regretfully, I was unaware of Jacksonville's rich Black history or the presence of redlining in our community's history until I got to college. And so now as a student, I'm very motivated to focus my research on better understanding our own community's history. So Jacksonville really is the tale of two cities. And I'd like to continue this conversation today by exploring how Jacksonville's history of racial zoning laws has shaped the communities in which we live today. So I'd like to do that by posing a couple questions. First, what exactly is redlining? And then secondly, what are the direct economic implications of redlining on our Jacksonville neighborhoods? So before we explore this issue further, I do think it's important to emphasize, which Ennis already did so well, that racial disparities in our city zoning history go back much further even than redlining. And downtown Jacksonville is home to historically Black neighborhoods, which for over a century were economically thriving. However, if you were to visit some of those same areas today, you may be greeted by vacant lots or abandoned buildings. And the divestment of these communities is a complex issue, one which I'll briefly touch on today. And it is important to know that the historic conditions and policies have made some of our Jacksonville neighborhoods especially susceptible to gentrification. Okay. So, as I said, for today, I'd like to focus in on one such policy, and that's Jacksonville's history of redlining. So redlining refers to the process by which the Federal Housing Administration, along with urban planners and banks, deemed predominantly Black communities as too high risk to provide home loans. And it can be seen in the systematic denial of mortgages, but also of insurance, of loans, and other financial services based on location, and therefore that area's default history, rather than on an individual's qualifications and, credit worthiness. So let's go back in American history, specifically to the GI Bill. So the GI Bill program guaranteed low-cost mortgage loans for returning World War II soldiers. But the redlining of American communities, including Jacksonville communities, limited the extent to which Black veterans were able to purchase homes in the growing suburbs. So during this time, investments were heavily prioritized in the growth of the mostly white suburbs. And this fueled a phenomenon known as white flight, which is the phenomenon of white people moving out of urban areas, particularly those with significant minority populations, and into suburban areas. Okay. So this practice meant that people of color were denied access to loans that would enable them to buy or repair homes in their neighborhood. And also, new white suburbs often came with overtly racist covenants that denied entry to Black people. So it's clear to see that redlining is a major national issue, but which also extends directly to our neighborhood. So then how exactly were Jacksonville communities categorized to be redlined? So the Homeowners Loan Corporation described redline areas of Jacksonville as quote unquote undesirable with overtly discriminatory language. So what you see on the screen are scans of the original Realty area map and area descriptions of redlined areas of Jacksonville. So I pulled out a few key quotes which show that decisions regarding which areas to redline were largely race-based. And you'll notice when you read through the quotes, the clear connection between the language and our troubled racial history. And these quotes provide clear evidence to me of the institutionalization of racism through redlining in our local history. So I'll give you a few moments, to review those quotes. Okay, so what does the impact of redlining in Jacksonville, Florida look like? So as it's written on the right, one of the most significant impacts of redlining is the stifling of the opportunity of Black communities in the nation and specifically in Jacksonville to build generational wealth. So historically, one of the most efficient and effective ways to build wealth over time is with the purchase of a home. So firstly, let's look to the map on the left, which layers areas of Jacksonville previously redlined over 2016 zip code boundaries. So I think this map helps us focus in more closely on which communities exactly in Jacksonville today most directly experienced redlining. So it's worthy to note that the areas of Jacksonville currently undergoing gentrification most directly surround the areas of Jacksonville previously redlined. Okay, so figure 1 shows the gap in economic prosperity today between areas predominantly white versus areas which are predominantly Black today. So the Economic Innovation Group's Distress Community Index provides a comparative measure of economic well-being across zip codes throughout the United States. So economic distress is a single summary statistic that conveys each zip code standing relative to its peers. So each zip code is measured based on 7 criteria, including the percent with no high school diploma, the poverty rate, percent of adults not working, median household income, and change of employment or housing vacancy. So the 5 zip codes with areas of land, the 9 zip codes with areas of land previously redlined are denoted in red on the scatter plot. And the 5 zip codes with the highest economic distress also represent areas of land previously redlined in Jacksonville. So areas with an economic distress score over 60% are considered at risk, while areas with an economic distress score over 80% are considered distressed, and all 9 of the zip codes, which include land that were previously redlined, are either considered at risk or in economic distress. So this second scatter plot homes in on one of the 7 metrics which depicts a community's economic well-being, and that would be housing vacancy rates. So figure 2 shows there's a positive linear relationship between housing vacancy and the percent of the population being of Black or African American descent. So zip codes with areas of land, again, previously redlined, are denoted in red on the scatter plots. So as displayed in figure 1, zip codes with the highest population of Black or African American people also experience the highest housing vacancy rates. And the 4 zip codes with the highest housing vacancy rates also represent areas of land previously redlined in Jacksonville. So the 3 zip codes with the lowest housing vacancy rates of previously redlined areas, that would be 32207, 32210, and 32204, all represent areas which have been largely gentrified. So big picture, what are the key takeaways today? One being that Jacksonville remains significantly racially and socioeconomically segregated. And ultimately, Jacksonville areas previously redlined continue to face infrastructural and economic disadvantages that do not extend to predominantly white areas of Jacksonville. And thirdly, the redlining of Jacksonville neighborhoods has played a major role in the divestment of those communities, which has ultimately made those communities especially susceptible to gentrification. And lastly, something that I'd like to add that I hope to study myself now as a public health student is that new research in 2020 was conducted that examined how the history of redlining, segregation, and disinvestment not only reduced minority wealth, it impacted the health outcomes in those neighborhoods. So on average, life expectancy is lower in redline communities when compared to the communities that existed at the same time, but were higher graded by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So on the final slide, I've just add some resources I use and that I'd recommend to anyone who'd like to further study the topic. One of them is, in fact, an interview that Mr. Ennis Davis did himself that I found quite useful in my own research. But feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. And ultimately, I hope this has just given you a taste on the tale of 2 cities that coexist in Jacksonville and offered some insight into the troubling implications that redlining continues to echo. And hopefully what I've covered with you today shows that it's not just a topic of history, but a serious matter that we need to continue to engage with because the impact is still clearly with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. That was pretty impactful. I think to better plan for the future is always important to understand, know your history. So Suzanne, based off that, I want to turn to you now. So I know you're involved with the historic Eastside CDC and Lift Jacksonville, and I know those 2 groups are poised to making the Eastside a local successful example of withintrification as new development continues to occur in the sports and entertainment district and other areas within the community. So can you tell us a little bit about the Eastside's history, its challenges, what those 2 organizations are doing to help revitalize the community, and while also looking to limit displacement and gentrification as revitalization occurs? You're on mute.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Ennis. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon. So I am Suzanne Pickett. As Ennis mentioned, I am the president of the Historic Eastside Community Development Corporation. I'm also a visual artist and a resident. So I live, work, worship, and play here in the Eastside neighborhood. I actually grew up here and got to experience Eastside when it was a self-sustaining neighborhood of African-American businesses, and also, unfortunately, have experienced the decline of the neighborhood as a result of what we just saw, the redlining and other systemic issues in the community. So Eastside's mission is to preserve and protect the historic neighborhood of Eastside. Eastside is the last historic neighborhood around downtown that has not faced complete gentrification. And then Lift Jax is an organization that that has an initiative to alleviate generational poverty, and they are now working with us within the Eastside neighborhood. So I am the vice president of the executive committee of Lift Jax. We're excited to have Lift Jax as a partner with us in the purpose-built model. So we, as you saw, there have been several factors that has contributed to the decline of the Eastside neighborhood. The historic Eastside CDC, we're 5 years old. We started actually as a community coalition just to engage and to protect the Eastside neighborhood. For many years, there has been disinvestment in Eastside for almost 5 decades now. So our goal is to maintain the current neighborhood, the current status of the community, while also building. So when you talk about gentrification, and Withintrification, we really are fighting against the gentrification, the displacement of the Eastside neighborhood. With Withintrification, we see strategies that can help alleviate that. So as a visual artist, I work to use my talents to beautify the neighborhood. And also we move forward in Withintrification in creating great partners, investors who want to come into the community or already into the community, but developing those partnerships, those organizations to assist in alleviating that Eastside. Eastside consists of 5 historic neighborhoods. So it's Fairfield, Oakland, Campbell's Addition, Long Branch, and the Phoenix area. So we cover that entire district. So we're working diligently, of course, in phases. And our first phase is the Campbell's Addition, the Oakland area, which is right outside of the sports entertainment district. And we're all familiar with the development that's happening all around us between the sports entertainment district, downtown Springfield, and the Cathedral District. So Eastside is right in the center of that development. And our goal is to be a complement to that development. So investors or builders and developers don't feel that they have to come in and displace a community, but that community can be a complement to what the goals are for the entire city. So that's where we are now. We are very successful, again, in building relationships with foundations, with, of course, Jessie Ball duPont Fund. We're excited. We're actually get terrified. I actually get terrified and excited about the development, because as it's moving quickly, we also need to, expand and increase our efforts to help residents be able to stay in place and prosper in the Eastside neighborhood. And that is just alleviating those barriers that cause us to lose residents in Eastside, which is, home repair, disrepair of homes, the crime, unfortunately, in the Eastside, the condition, the capital, and the lack of capital improvements in the Eastside. So we are working again with our partners to make those improvements. So the 5 generations of residents that live in the Eastside are able to stay and remain here as the neighborhood grows and expands.
Great, you said a lot there, and I'm going to come back to you on a question if I don't see it pop up in the chat box. But at this time, Tony, I want to move on to you quick here. And so I know that you've been involved with several grassroots initiatives related to righting the wrongs that continue to plague redline communities and the residents living in them. Can you tell us a bit about those efforts you're involved in and why you believe reparative justice is needed for communities like Northwest Jacksonville?
First of all, I just want to say thank everyone for inviting me on. It's an honor to be one of the panelists. And I feel thrilled to be on today. I'm excited. But to kind of answer your question, I initially was passionate about the area in which Edward Waters resides. And one of the reasons why I was passionate about that area is because it is home to the oldest HBCU in the state of Florida. And we're talking about with gentrification, and I felt like if we ever were going to build and kind of, bring restoration to a community that needed it, I felt like that was a good starting place. And in terms of what we've been involved in, the NAACP is behind me in terms of providing documentation based on redlining, based on some of the things we've talked about, that documentation, to take it to elected officials as well as grassroots organizations to form a consolidation or a group effort in which we present to the powers that be, based on that data and based on those analytics, why we should have reparative justice. As you know, we've been in discussions with Asheville, North Carolina. They passed a resolution for what we're calling reparations. Last year, I've also been in contact with Evanston, Illinois. They have a specific housing program in which they tax cannabis and do some other things in order to levy some money to restore housing and give individuals in that area who have been damaged by discriminatory acts the ability to own their house. And we all know if you own your house and have a level of ownership to pass that down generationally, that's the beginning. So what I wanted to do is I actually wanted to kind of narrow down my focus on the Newtown, Moncrief, and Durkeeville area to really focus in on those areas that have been historically redlined and come together with all organizations who are interested in all of the ills of society in those communities. When we talk about over-policing, when we talk about, the inability to own a home, when we talk about unemployment, transportation, food shortages, all of those things we can trace back to redlining. The other thing too is in terms of being able to get to certain places in your community and, in close proximity, we want to kind of shrink that and provide a community that folks don't have to go outside of their community and they don't have to enjoy some of the trappings of everyday life, but they have it right there in their own community. So again, I'm just tickled to death because we've made some inroads in terms of reaching out, but yet and still there are some things we need to do. And since we're talking about the color of law, one of the things I liked about Richard Rothstein's book is there were some remedies at the end. And he didn't necessarily say reparations, but I know there's a growing pushback in terms of race-based initiative. And what's interesting about that is for communities that were socially engineered based on race, I find it, ironic that we're talking about race-based initiatives today. And so one of the things that we want to do as the NAACP, I know we are labeled as an advocacy group, but we also want to push for economic development. And we believe that if we have all hands on deck, if we have the correct data, and we can come together with some of the other organizations that are trying to get the end result, but not necessarily the same methodology, I believe that we can kind of, change the narrative in some of these communities. Because right now I feel positive about what Suzanne is doing. I love the information that Caroline disseminated. I love what you've been doing for years. But I'm also excited and energized with other cities outside of Jacksonville. And I feel like if they can do it there, we can do it here.
That's great and appreciate that positive response. So what I'm going to do now, with the rest of our time, I want to open this up to a Q&A. We do have several questions that have started popping up in the box here. As I read these out, all three of you feel free to answer. If you don't answer, I may have something I may say myself on some of these. So with that said, I'm going to start off with the first question here, and it is, within the context of Withintrification, what are the economic development tenets of this model, if any, to reverse and protect the loss of generational wealth building since redlining? I know I said a mouthful there, so I can repeat it if you need me to. I'll say it again. It is within the context of Withintrification. What are the economic development tenets of this model to reverse and protect the loss of generational wealth building since redlining?
I'll answer that question as I think I understand that the attendee is asking what are our strategies for the current, is it current residents? So it is current residents who live in Eastside, but also is understanding that with the current development, new residents are coming in the Eastside neighborhood. So with the current residents right now, we are offering initiatives to alleviate those barriers. We're creating economic opportunity through jobs, working with partners and surrounding developers, also creating incubators and services for the small businesses that are in the Eastside neighborhood. We have a restore and repair program where we are working to restore the homes of residents who live in Eastside, homes that are owner occupied, but also what we're finding with a lot of our properties is that they are heirs properties. So those properties are remaining in the family, but still in the name of that original mortgage holder. So we are working with LISC and Three Rivers Legal to assist those clients in going through the probate process so they can actually retain that asset and continue to build generational wealth.
Great. Okay, that's a lot, and I mean, it's very important. I know the project that you're working on with LISC and you know, bringing people back into community by helping with mortgages to allow them to build new homes in the community.
Right, exactly.
That's big and very important to get people who economically can live elsewhere to move, you know, back into our urban core neighborhoods. That's a good way to innovative way to help stabilize from the inside out as well. I'm going to ask another question here. This one may be for you, Suzanne. It's got your name on it. It's going right down the list. It says, basically, thank you for all you do for the Eastside. And this attendee's concern is Phoenix Avenue. Her concern is Phoenix Avenue near 21st Street. So I guess this is the Long Branch area. I've seen plans for 15th to 17th. Are there any plans for that area on Phoenix Avenue?
So we do, so the entire barriers of the historic Eastside CDC spans through Phoenix and out 21st and the Long Branch Avenue. We're working in phases as the area in Oakland and Campbell's Addition is the area closest to gentrification. So as we prioritize those phases, and Oakland area is phase 1, we are working in those areas as well. And we have partners in other organizations such as Desks for a Change, who have been working in that area for many, many years to continue to revitalize that area, those areas. So we're working in those areas as well.
Okay. So I'm going to ask, here's a question from the Q&A box. This one is, what are some specific policies and legislations that can be pursued locally that can begin to reverse the harmful effects of redlining?
Is that for you, Ennis?
I think it's for anybody, but I can jump in and answer that too. So, I guess I'll get that started. As an urban planner, I know I deal a lot with public policy across the country in the projects I work in. I would say some of those policies, you can go all the way back to that zoning policy that was first established back in the 1920s. Essentially, everything we've done since then has been built off of that policy. So if we know we have zoning policies on the books that have disenfranchised these neighborhoods from the start, an easy thing that we can do locally is to revise our policy. I know, for example, the Eastside is in the process of looking to do a zoning overlay that is more culturally appropriate for the residents there as well as protecting the history and limiting the displacement of the residents in that particular area. Something else I would toss out would be many of these neighborhoods are well over the age of 50 years old. So in a sense, they can be designated as historic districts. Some people will say that historic districts can cause gentrification. Well, local historic districts or districts that have policies that force you to restore your homes with certain types of materials that cost more and raise the cost of that can displace communities where there are economic challenges. However, the federal level, the National Register, that designation is more honorary, honors that history, but what it does do is also it gives equitable and inclusive access to those who are willing to seek federal tax credits or apply for grants associated with historic properties within those borders. And by being designated as a National Register Historic District, you have the ability to then institute a zoning overlay on top of that to help better protect the neighborhood as well.
Does it have heights on it?
Can I just kind of dive in with you, Ennis,
feel free.
real quick? Now you just articulated the policies, the historical context of it and what that looks like today. One of the things I want to talk about as part of one of our initiatives is Red Alliance for Justice, which is based on trying to get specific solutions and or a specific ask for this municipality and for this local government. We want to partner with individuals. We want to wear all red. We want to have the map of all red line areas, particularly in the area that I just mentioned on the back of it. We want to have a demand for all elected officials that are in these areas that represent these areas. And so that's where the data and that's where the analytics come into play. We do not believe that, local elected officials are going to act on their own. If they were going to do that, they probably would have done that already. So what everybody that's on this panel, I guess I am the one who is the quote unquote advocate. And I believe there is a space for that. I do not believe that it's going to come easy. I believe just like everything else we've gotten, we've had to kind of advocate and we've had to kind of demand. So in order for us to really change these communities, in my opinion, there has to be a level of buy-in from the community, and there has to be a level of advocacy in terms of not only knowing the information, but being able to have a specific ask for what we want to have stability in these communities and raise the quality of living that is equal to all of the areas in Jacksonville that Caroline articulated earlier. So in other words, what I'm saying is, I am definitely saying that we are, as an NAACP, as an organization, looking to partner with individuals who want to focus in on Redline specifically. We want to organize and we want to demand from our elected officials that we get real change, and we want real change soon. The strategy behind that is, with the things that Suzanne is already doing, it will speed up the process in terms of them from an elected official position and space to give them and other communities what they need if they have that pressure from the community, particularly from the NAACP. So I just kind of wanted to slide in and talk about that a little bit. I know we talked about policy. I know we've talked about the historical context of our issues, but I also want to talk about the advocacy piece of what that looks like and how we can put pressure on the powers that be here in Jacksonville, Florida.
Before I go to the next question, I'm going to throw in something else from the transportation side. I do know that the federal government now has been looking at various policies and programs to restore and rebuild a lot of what was ripped down with the construction of expressways and highways during the 50s and 60s and 70s. Jacksonville was certainly at the forefront of that. Our interstate or Interstate 95 actually predates the interstate system. So we are one of the earlier cities to really use highways as a way to rip apart many of these neighborhoods. So by that particular focus from just a policy or planning perspective, we can look at some of these older expressways that we have that are reaching this age where they have to be rebuilt or restored at some point. We may want to reconsider restoring what was done in the 1950s and actually perhaps repairing the street grid and the connectivity that was lost in many of these neighborhoods. That did lead to a change in the travel flow of various commercial districts, which if you have less traffic, less visibility, it also makes it more difficult for commercial enterprises to survive as well. So that's something else I'll throw in terms of public policy and legislation there.
Well, Ennis, I have a follow-up question also for you. When you spoke specifically about the historical designations and how those play out differently depending on the specificity of what type of historical designation it is, I know that in San Marco and in Riverside, that those are, my understanding is that they're on the National Registry. Is that true? So
San Marco, I do not believe is on the National Register. Riverside and Springfield are, and they are also local historic districts. So the local historic designation on those two districts, there are designed within the zoning overlays they have. There are design guidelines and things that you have to go by when working in that area on historic properties, as well as your infill development has to be designed to certain standards. All right, so I'm gonna go back to the chat box because questions are just flowing in now. So the next question is going to be, considering the racial segregation of the history of Jacksonville, colorism within the Gullah Geechee community and without, do you find this practice of exclusion vs inclusion playing out in redline areas identified? And I guess that one may be a mouthful, but I think this is one that you guys could probably jump right in on. Does Withintrification measure community engagement as a form of success? And I'll jump in on that real quick. Oh, Suzanne, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Oh, does Withintrification measure community engagement as a form of success?
I believe it does. Yeah, community engagement is necessary for the Withintrification in the potential partners or interested parties who want to come in and develop into the community.
And I would just jump on the backside of that as well. One of the big differences between Withintrification and gentrification is community engagement. You got to have the community engagement in not public involvement, but actually community engagement from the start. No consultant such as, or a planner as myself or a politician can tell you what your community needs. That's what you've grown up in, that's what you live, that's where your parents, your grandparents were at. So in essence, you need that engagement to understand what the issues are, and based off of understanding those issues, coming up with solutions and partnerships to alleviate the obstacles that stop revitalization for the community that is there. When that community doesn't have a seat at the table, they're typically the mill. And when you're the mill, you're probably going to end up displaced. So that's when you see a lot of cultural heritage sites that are important to a community, being demolished for apartment complexes or shopping centers. And that's just because that community, their voice hasn't been heard and is not truly being considered. So that's a big part of the difference between Withintrification and gentrification is really Withintrification is community input first, and then planning and implementation coming after that. All right, I'm going to keep scrolling here. All right, so here's another question. Do you consider the impact from redlining has ultimately led to a public nuisance by the city of Jacksonville failing to address and prioritize our local concerns, harms, and conditions? Let me read that again. Do you consider the impact from redlining? Do you consider the impact from do you consider, trying to frame this right. Do you consider the impact of redlining, has it ultimately led to a public nuisance by the city of Jacksonville and failing to address and prioritize local concerns, harms, and conditions?
And Ennis, it looks like there's actually some follow-up information to that question
Okay.
later in the chat.
All right, let's see. I might have to come back to that one. And I guess this is the comment for Tony. Did Tony leave? I don't see him on the list anymore. I think he might have dropped off. Okay, yeah, okay, never mind. So Tony had to drop off, but I will get this information to Tony, to the person who referenced that. And so just to follow up to the first question that I just went through, and I'm gonna read that question again, then I'm going to the follow-up response, and we'll see if we can tackle that answer. The question was, do you consider the impact from redlining has ultimately led to a public nuisance by the city of Jacksonville failing to address and prioritize local concerns, harms, and conditions? And then the follow-up to that is a point of reference. As of October the 1st, the attorneys have accused the city of Tulsa and other defendants of causing a public nuisance by failing to make reparations for the massacre. So I assume this is the massacre back in the 20s, leading to subsequent litigation against the city for denying access to important historical documents relating to the massacre and the violation of the Oklahoma Open Records Act. So that's a lot there. Let me see if I can frame this up in a shorter version for you to potentially try to answer here. So I guess in general, we could probably say, do you believe a result of redlining, that a result of redlining could be a public nuisance by the city for failing to address, prioritize many of the concerns of these neighborhoods? And Caroline, that may be something that you had some data on, just looking at comparison of those the majority Black communities back in the 1930s and how they shaped up economically versus other areas that may play into that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can speak to just briefly, not exactly to the question, but I think to the point, which is what we spoke to, which is Jacksonville is a tale of two cities. And so to your point, that does the history of redlining in those communities are now causing some community, as you said, nuisance, but maybe some difficulty and misunderstanding between the communities in which the people live, not having their concerns addressed maybe by our fellow community members and also by public policy laws. And I think, as Ennis has spoke to previously, which is that the public policy and the urban planning decisions that are in place today, the foundation of which were in redlining. And so I think that absolutely that, you know, we need to address the structural racism that's present in our community, and it absolutely continues to affect these communities today. And so in that way, it also does affect the relationship between the communities and neighborhoods in Jacksonville, and then in our public officials and in our advocates. We're all, so I don't know if that exactly answers that question, but yes, we are a tale of two cities. Absolutely. The effects of redlining continue to exist today, and I think continue as we continue to have difficult conversations. I think some people's voices will not feel like they've been heard, because certainly in our history, that's been the case.
And I could try to jump in there and add a little 2 cents on this from a public policy standpoint. You know, certainly policies that are in play do have an impact on the economic health of, and even the challenges of many of these communities that we're talking about today. You know, for example, from a transportation standpoint, you know, many of our red line communities were where those initial expressways were constructed in the 50s and 60s. At that particular point in time, we didn't have any policy for things like noise walls. At some point in time, the federal government made a decision that that was actually not what they should have been doing in you know, putting highways through residential areas and not, you know, trying to buffer the noise and negative impacts that come from that. So now, when you construct a new highway or you widen a new highway, if it's deemed to have negative impact to a residential community, as a part of that project, you'll get a noise wall built, for example. So if you looked at how that plays out over time, that funding source wasn't retroactive. So you won't see projects where you're just putting the walls up just to put walls up, but you're not really impacting the highway. Typically, it has to be included as a part of a widening or a reconstruction project. So if you went down Butler Boulevard today, St. John's Town Center has a new noise wall up, you know. However, if you went down, you know, I-95 or MLK Parkway in Moncrief or through the Eastside, you've got houses facing the expressway. You got stormwater runoff going into residential streets, but there's nothing there to buffer that and to protect that. And that's because that's a result of policy not retroactively being able to you know, fix those areas. Those areas are still disenfranchised by even policies that we intended to correct. So as a result, you know, you do have areas in your highways that are considered to be dump spots for, you know, trash or areas of overgrown that are overgrown and not, you know, well maintained, that contribute to this belief that, you know, certain communities are blighted in comparison. So I mean, that's a result of public policy. But I will also say that even within the last year or so, you know, there's been several different initiatives and programs, even with the gas tax discussion here, the local option gas tax discussion in Jax, about making sure a certain percentage of these funds and projects go back to these areas that have been traditionally redlined and not totally disinvested in. So in that particular instance, I think there's the opportunity for more inclusive, integrated public outreach and engagement to make sure that funds that have been set aside for these different initiatives are being spent in the right way that helps repair some of the things that we may deem as public nuisances today. All right, so let's see what else we have here. This is just a general comment. As a Jacksonville native who just returned after living elsewhere for 30 plus years, I'm grateful for today's program. The Tale of Two Cities, as Caroline mentioned, is a tragedy. The action discussed today is a sign of hope. Thank you all presenters and to the Jessie Ball duPont Fund. And yeah, I'll just comment on that again. I do think it's important to continue to pull as many people together. I know we're a large city. We have a lot of large issues. We all have our different areas of expertise. So when we get in venues like this and cross-pollinate that information together, it helps us to better problem solve, and it helps us to better achieve the goals that each of the various agencies, municipalities, nonprofits, and other organizations are working. And for the most part, the rest of these are pretty much just comments saying thank you. So before we start to close anything out, I will turn to my remaining two panelists. Well, here we got one more here, and then I'll return to you two if nothing else pops up in the chat box. This comment mentions to reverse the historical wrongs from redlining and to fulfill the promises of consolidation, the city needs to pass race-conscious laws and not merely race-neutral laws. So that was just a comment, pretty much kind of supporting that we do need to be strategic as we tackle the modification of policies that have hurt many of our communities throughout the city. So I'm going to turn to you, Caroline and Suzanne, and see if you have any comments or questions or anything you want to add before we start wrapping the panel discussion up.
So I would just absolutely thank you, Ennis, and then the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund for starting this conversation on this topic. And we are having an art exhibit to continue this work. We'll let you guys know we're planning it in our new A. Philip Randolph Cultural Center. But I also want to ask anyone, and we are often asked how you can help in this process, and the way that you can help is if within the city or any other realms or circles where you hear anyone talking about developing in the East Side or around these neighborhoods, to let them know or to encourage them to reach out to the leaders and just encourage the Withintrification as opposed to gentrification or displacement of these neighborhoods.
Thank you, Susan. And I want to just parallel your point, which is it's an honor to be here, and especially as a student of this topic as well. I'm honored to be here and learn from Suzanne and Anthony and Ennis as well. And from my own personal experience, one point to be made is the necessity for community engagement. And as Ennis said, Jacksonville is a huge city with diverse experience. And I have found that generally zip code to zip code, the communities can feel very segregated, not just racially and economically, but also we're just very generally unaware of each other. And I do think that conversations like this definitely help build that, bridge that gap. And so I also feel very hopeful and thankful to be a part of that conversation.
Great, and I'm going to add 2 cents, but I'm going to read one more comment. And this is from a resident whose father grew up on the East Side. It says, my father walked on dirt roads to Old Gilbert Middle School from Van Buren Street in the 1940s without street lights and running water. And he just wants to thank everyone for continuing to focus in our efforts in this particular area. And he mentions that there's a need for more historical references to the community prior to 1901. And I will say, that's very important as well. Most people believe that, all of Jacksonville was destroyed by the Great Fire in 1901, and that's not necessarily true. The Great Fire was just in downtown. So many of the neighborhoods we talked about today are actually Gullah Geechee communities that date back to Reconstruction, just after the Civil War, that surround downtown Jacksonville. So they do have structures, culture, and history that predates 1901 and dates back into the 19th century. But putting on my planner hat here, you mentioned without streetlights. I will say, just going back to the difference between withintrification and gentrification, the biggest difference is upfront and transparent community engagement from the start. That is where you drive to come out with your end game. You have to start with community engagement. And one example, just thinking of street lights, I remember, and Tony's not on the phone anymore, but I remember meeting with him about a month ago and many others over in Moncrief area. And there's desire for streetlights. People mentioned they wanted streetlights. People mentioned they wanted better bus stops. They wanted roads resurfaced. And, but they had no clue that there was this local option gas tax that had a certain amount of millions of dollars allocated to that particular neighborhood. But if you looked at the project list for what the money was supposed to be spent for, the money was allocated to roundabouts. So that is like a small example of an area would like to see funds help to improve. However, there's a disconnect between what the community may deem as a true need on the infrastructure side and what ended up in the priority list or the project list. So millions of dollars could be spent in the community, but those millions of dollars are beautifying an intersection and not actually addressing streetlights, which is also an infrastructure need that could probably be tied back into a funding source like that. So that's just a small example of why, with gentrification, that community engagement upfront is truly needed. And when that's taken up front, you have the opportunity, a better opportunity to revitalize in a way that guides new growth, infill growth in certain areas that help support the community, but also can protect other areas and residents that are there from displacement and gentrification. So with that said, in conclusion, I do want to say that this event is the 5th of 6 virtual discussions in the 2021 Jacksonville History and Heritage Series that is co-produced by the Jessie Ball duPont Fund and myself, the APA Florida chapter, as well as the Jaxson magazine. Our 6th event will focus on Jacksonville's military history, and it will be hosted virtually on Tuesday, November the 9th. So we love to have you join us as well. So stay tuned for more details by following the Jaxson Mag on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, or thejacksonmag.com. So in closing, I do want to just thank all our panelists again and all our guests again for taking time today to spend a little over an hour with us on this important virtual panel conversation. Thank you, and have a good day, and have a good weekend.